Welcome to another edition of our at-home Bible study on the life of Christ. And we continue to pray for your safety and health during this time of social distancing and physical distancing, and pray that you are also getting an opportunity, maybe even to join the drive-in services that are happening on Sundays and Wednesdays. And do hope that your family and all those you love are staying safe and well. Continue to watch for announcements from the Highland Park elders coming from the church office related to our services and how we'll be proceeding, and they will keep us informed as to what is best and what is next for us, for our congregation. Today, we are moving on in a selected study of the life of Christ, and due to the time format, we don't know exactly how many weeks we will have in this setting. So we're just kind of jumping around in the life of Christ to various stories in his life, and but we have done so in chronological order thus far, and we'll continue that trend today. And so I'm going to share with you, as I try to do each week, the synopsis of the Gospels that we've been following. Last week, we talked about Jesus's preaching in his hometown of Nazareth, and what happened in the synagogue that day. And this is all part of his ministry in Galilee. We've covered now, I won't recount every story that we've covered now because we've been at this for a few weeks now, but we are still in the ministry in Galilee, which according to the synoptics, that's the first ministry that they tell us about. According to the Gospel of John, we have a little more information, and that relates to Jesus' ministry in and around Judea, and then the ministry in Galilee. So we have followed Jesus's preach in his ministry in Galilee, his sermon content and reaction in his first preaching, and then we've talked about his preaching in Nazareth. So we did a couple of weeks back to back on that, and the implications and the effect that it had on his audience. And so now I thought we would focus on one of the call stories in the Gospels, where Jesus calls, in this particular instance, Matthew is the one, Levi Matthew is the one we will look at. He also calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They have a detailed call story as well, as you can see here, which happens prior to the call of Levi or Matthew. But we will focus in today, and there, as you can see, there's a list of several things that do happen and occur between the preaching at Nazareth and the call of Levi Matthew. It is a simple story, but I think it is an important and profound one in terms of our thinking about ourselves, and then also our thinking about others and their relationship to the gospel and relationship to Jesus. So many of the thoughts I have, as you know, I always tell you, they're not original with me. I take these from things that I read and enjoy to study, and I'm always looking for the next idea from other places, and so I'm indebted to the work of others here. So I'd like to focus our attention on the account of the story we find in Matthew itself, but we will look at, as you can see, the stories parallel pretty closely, as you can see on your screen, hopefully. And hopefully I've got that large enough for you to see. And the reason why I want to focus on Matthew itself is to think about this and to imagine it from the perspective of an autobiography. Can you imagine Matthew with his pen in his hand writing the gospel, and then as he comes to this particular passage, as he shares his story of Jesus's call, him coming to this place in his writing and thinking and reflecting on it. Can you imagine how he must have felt as he recounted his own story? And the teaching that Jesus does in this passage is powerful, not only in and of itself in the words, but when you think about it in these terms, it's deeply affecting to understand this is not just Matthew sharing this as a matter of fact that Jesus said this, but that Matthew felt and experienced this call himself. And so this is deeply personal to him. It's not just a story that he's recounting. And I've tried for a long time to understand in the modern world what might be a type of job that could be hated in the same way that the job of tax collectors were as Jews in the Roman Empire. And I've approached this several different ways and done several Google searches and things. And one of the most recent ones I did was to look up occupations with bad reputations. And surprisingly, number one on the list was dentists, stock traders, school principals, used car salesmen, lawyers, tax examiners, TV news anchors, and politicians were what came up on the list. Now, if you are in one of those occupations, don't despair, because I don't see these in quite the same way. Of course, I did not live in the first century and get to experience Jewish tax collector myself, but personally, but it does not appear to me, based on the things that I read, that any of these occupations come into the same level of disrepute as a tax collector, a Jewish tax collector in particular in the first century. We don't feel angst, not at that kind of level, against these jobs that I've just mentioned. We oftentimes will joke at the expense of some of these particular occupations, but being a tax collector in the Roman world, especially if you were a Jew, was really a whole other ball game, totally different playing field. In first century Palestine, they were especially unpopular. Part of this was because they worked on behalf of the Romans and in gathering taxes, and anything that they gathered was a frustration on the part of Jews, in the sense that it's particularly insulting to be beholden to the Romans. Also, though, it was partly because many tax collectors were extortionate, and so they would not only take the required taxes for Rome and those that they had to turn over to Rome, but they would make their own living by the amount that they took, as you would say, off the top. So there are no more wicked people in the Bible, in the New Testament, you might put it this way, than tax collectors. One of the reasons why I would say this is because in many passages in the New Testament, Jesus will use the word tax collectors to be equivalent to the term sinners. And sometimes you will see tax collectors and sinners mentioned almost in the same breath. And so this is a different level of disdain in the first century. And in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5:46, he'll say, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? So you can, and this is in Matthew's own account of the gospel of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, and the call of Matthew is in Matthew 9. So you can imagine Matthew recounting these stories. The taxes in mind here are an interesting subject of study and debate of whether we're talking about temple taxes here, or we're talking about taxes levied on goods, where you have to pass through a certain area, or near the lake where people would be crossing, and then they would pay for the goods that they pay taxes on the goods in which they're transporting. It's really I do not know. There are plenty of things out there you could look at and study regarding the taxes to understand what they were like. But the best way I can put it into modern understanding or thinking would be thinking about how much we like to pay tolls when we travel in Florida. I know we're not getting to travel in Florida right now, but if you've done much driving in Florida, you know you've got to pay the tolls. How much do you appreciate when TSA chooses to choose you for a search when you're trying to get on a plane? Matthew is that kind of guy. He's the guy that is collecting the tolls, doing the searches, and plus some. So that's about as close as I can get, but that is not equivalent to the Jewish mindset here in the first century. So, but it's the best I can do. And Matthew, as he shares this story, he knows what sort of person he was, and he knows the social issues that are at play when it comes to interacting with Jesus. And he's the one sharing the story about how a man called Jesus came to him in spite of those social barriers and asked him to follow him. So I would pause here for just a moment and ask you, have you ever reflected on your life and the life you had before you came to Christ, and thought about how different your life would have been or could have been as a result of not having Christ in your life? Have you wondered why Jesus called you? Not why he called to humans in general, but why did he call you? What was his reason, and why not someone else? With all of our weaknesses and all of our problems and frailties, why did God reach out to us specifically through someone? And who was that someone who broke the barrier, so to speak, and was willing to talk to you and ask you to follow Jesus? We all have that person in our lives. So if Christ was choosing an apostle, why didn't he select a Pharisee? Or if you needed an evangelist, why not choose one of the scribes? A tax collector and a sinner was who Jesus chose in this particular story. And maybe it is that person or you are the one that Jesus needs to accomplish his purposes. Christ has found many people in prison. He's found a friend and a late friend that I had out of prison, and his ministry began in prison. And several of my students have come to study the gospel because of their experiences in the depths of alcohol and drug addiction or other life problems. So who knows whether or not God might find for you his high purpose to bless you and then to make you a blessing to other people. I don't know, but I do know that it is certain that many of God's most honored and useful servants are from this very class of people that Matthew comes from, tax collectors and sinners. But if you notice the story, as the story unfolds, when Matthew invites, we might even think of this as Matthew throws a party for his friends when he makes this decision to follow Jesus, and he brings Jesus basically a huge evangelistic opportunity in his home to come and to eat with them and to have and share fellowship with them. But as many things that Jesus did do, this event scandalized the Pharisees. They would not have been invited to the dinner, so there was no worry there. It's not as though Matthew invited the Pharisees to dinner and then they were offended. It must have been that the house was open and it was clear to see, and that they would have been able to tell from what was happening in the home that this scandalous event was taking place, that Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners. Pharisees were particularly abhorrent of becoming unclean in this way. Having too much fellowship with this class of people could have caused some uncleanness in their sense. So they ask then why Jesus engages in table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. And we shouldn't take this as an innocent question, as though they are innocently seeking a detailed response as to why Jesus is doing this. This was not really that sort of question. It's more of an accusation because sharing a meal with someone was considered a closer association with them than simply teaching them. So it's one thing to teach sinners and request for them to repent, but quite another to share a meal with them. And therefore it was more blameworthy in the eyes of these Pharisees to do so. And it almost was interpreted, we can glean that it was almost interpreted as a endorsement of their behavior to be sitting at a meal with them in Matthew's home. And they could not, under the Pharisees, for the life of themselves, they could not understand how Jesus was engaged in this. But what's interesting is if you look closely in the story, the Pharisees ask his disciples this question: why is your teacher, which, by the way, your teacher is the way outside groups refer to Jesus, your teacher, over and against other teachers. With the tax collectors and sinners, that's their question to the disciples. But look what happens when Jesus hears the question. Jesus does not allow them to respond. He doesn't give the disciples the opportunity to think up an answer in this setting. He immediately responds to this question without waiting for them to think it up, and takes an humble illustration from ordinary life, where it's the sick and not the well who need medical help and attention. This is not hard to make spiritual application of, and we should not miss the implied rebuke of the Pharisees included in this. And that is, in other words, the Pharisees saw themselves as well, in the sense that Jesus was using the word, and the tax collectors and sinners as sick. And so he is willing to be a healthy person helping to heal the sick. And this is by implication to the Pharisees. Why can they not see this concern to help the sick? And why are they not helping to reach out to the tax collectors and sinners who are in their sickness? So you think about it that way, and then you also think about this in Matthew's own terms, thinking about his own experience with Jesus, the one who took time to come to him in his little tax booth and choose to be the doctor on that day. And as I mentioned before, we all have these spiritual giants in our life who took the time and the energy to be that physician for us when we were sick. And Matthew was so moved that he brought all of his friends together in this place and invited Jesus. And Jesus was not going to miss the opportunity to help the sick with his life and his involvement. One final thing to note here is this interesting. It's only in Matthew. If you look at the different synoptic gospels, but if you look here, the quotation that is made at the end of Hosea 6:6, at the end of this story in Matthew, is that, "Go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners," is an interesting and unique statement here by Jesus, because nothing so far has been talked about regarding sacrifice. So why did Jesus say this? Well, it's not about sacrifice, really. The idea is about compassion, and that's the point of what he's saying. You might interpret this, and it has been interpreted by many people, this statement in Hosea 6:6, not as a total antithesis. Either you can be compassionate or you can sacrifice, but rather, if you don't have compassion, then it doesn't matter how much you sacrifice. Compassion is just as important, more so than compassion, you might even say. Compassion is more so than sacrifice. And if you are rigidly sacrificing, but you don't have compassion for people, which was the issue here in Matthew's calling and in the response of the Pharisees, then you need to learn something, is what Jesus is saying. In the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And Jesus, what's beautiful about this story is he doesn't just teach them this concept that you must have compassion. He actually shows it to them by his calling of Matthew. So as you think about your life, are you a Matthew? Are you in the class of tax collector and sinner who needs a Jesus? Or are you a Pharisee? Are you looking out on the outside and you don't really want to get your hands dirty? Compassion is not really your thing. You just really like to keep it to yourself and stay out of the dirty work of bringing God to people who need him? Or are you a Jesus? Are you someone who, not the Jesus, none of us can be the Jesus individually, but are we reaching out and trying to be someone who bridges this divide and tries to heal the sick and make the sick whole again? I hope these thoughts are of some benefit to you, and I do pray that as we continue this, that we will remain safe, and when the elders bring us back together again, that we will be able to move forward in a new way, in a helpful way with one another. Do appreciate you. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me.